Hello everyone, this is Peter, and welcome to the January 20th, 2010 weekly radio address for the Zeitgeist Movement. I hope everyone out there is doing well. I've been critically busy with too many things, and before I begin to answer your questions, let me go through some talking points that I'd like to address. First of all, I was going to have Andrew Buxton of the VenusProjectDesign.com on to discuss some issues that were going on, but he couldn't make it due to a scheduling conflict. But I did want to relay his request that he is seeking experienced database developers to help upgrade their existing PHP database. They had some technical issues, and they need some help from some technical help from some people out there. So if you want to help Andrew at the VenusProjectDesign.com, you can simply send an email to, quote, mail, M-A-I-L, at thevenusprojectdesign.com. He would greatly appreciate that. And by the way, if people out there are not familiar with this institution, if you will, this extension of the Venus Project, which is a group of volunteer 3D artists that are doing tremendous work, making some visual references for the cities and some other technological stuff, designs by Jacques Fresco, in other words. Check them out, especially if you work in the realm of 3D and you can do modeling. This is a tremendous example of people working together in a common medium to try and create important expressions that need to get out there as far as some of Jacques' designs to really give life to his models and his city systems. I have the good fortune of seeing some examples that they can't make public right now, but seeing some examples when I was visiting the Venus Project, and I'm extremely impressed with what Andrew and everyone is doing. I really commend everyone out there that's helping with this. And he's also agreed to allow some of it to be shown, that's in development, to be shown for Zeitgeist Day in New York. So I'm going to try to have a section of their work for that event day, which of course will be streamed so other people can see it as well. It's truly good, truly good. And let's see here, the second point, I just want to bring up Zeitgeist Day in general. We have about 100 submissions in the short time the site's been up at zday2010.org. So I've been really happy with the response. We got a lot of great people. The map is getting to be very impressive. We still have a little less than 2 months to go, so I'm very excited to see how this unfolds. 1/4 of the tickets for the Z-Day New York has been sold out, so that's good. Those are moving quickly, and it's going to be a very intense program for those that can make it. We're also considering, it was brought up in a conference that I had, maybe we can all meet in Central Park the day after on Sunday for those that do attend, and we can have a place to actually talk a little bit after the event if people are still around on Sunday. As you know, the event is Saturday afternoon and in the evening. Regarding press and promotion for your Zeitgeist Day event, this is very critical. The success of the event day is really only as good as how much press it achieves. Of course, bringing in new people that aren't familiar with the movement and expressing our ideas and values is very, very critical. But if you can't get it into the media, it's not going to have as much of an effect. So I want to make sure everyone out there that's doing a Zeitgeist Day event, I personally am paying out the nose for a PR person to do everything they can globally to get press. This is a global event. This is the kind of thing that should make it to CNN, it should make it to NBC, it should make it to all the mainstream networks, at least in part, because it's very much unprecedented, and it's just a matter of getting the interest there and getting people to push forward with the expression. Excuse me, I'm not explaining that very well. We need people to contact media at all costs, and that's, I can't express that enough. So do whatever you can. That's the next level once you have your event, or even if you're just helping out with an event, or you know an event in your area and you're not directly a part of it, do what you can to make internet presence, and then of course contact mainstream outlets in every country. Very important. I have a feeling Europe, we're going to get a lot of great press. The United States is always limited. As I've mentioned before, the U.S. is probably going to be one of the last to kind of understand this direction, if you know what I mean. The indoctrination value systems of most people in the United States, it's a little bit hardened, more hardened than you find in other countries that are essentially not as wealthy and haven't been as spoiled, if you will. So anyway, I won't belabor that, but press is very critical, so please do what you can. I'm going to try and create a press package soon that will be on the Z-Day Toolkit page, which will provide tips and anything, provide lists of radio stations you can contact, lists of broadcast stations. As I've also mentioned before, if you know people that do public access in your region, please contact them. There is a universal rights release for my films to be shown, broadcast or theatrical on the zday2010.org site. Of course, all of our lecture stuff is Creative Commons. That can be shown absolutely anywhere without the release. Those are also on DVD. And yeah, I won't belabor that anymore. Let's see here. Other projects, I just want to quickly point out the Zeitgeist Media Project. I've been given the guarantee that by the end of January that's going to be up. Again, I apologize for that. I'm extremely excited about the Zeitgeist Media Project, which will be at zeitgeistmediaproject.com. And once it's up, I think it's going to be a terrific hub for our communications team. And I'll leave it at that. From Earth to Venus is also in development. We have a developers team that is working to get the back end going with this. Tank Topper Knoll is essentially heading this development. I wanted to quickly give some suggestions for those that aren't familiar with this. Obviously, you can read the forum description on from what the project From Earth to Venus is going to consist of. But there are two books, I think, apart from Jacques Fresco's The Best That Money Can't Buy, two other books I think that are really good. In fact, there's probably many books, but there's two other I just want to mention that I think are worth referencing. One is Buckminster Fuller's Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. That's a really nice treatment on a holistic approach to the globe. He's a little difficult to read sometimes, but you just have to be patient and go slow with it. The other book is by Medard Gable, that was in association with the World Game Workshop, which happened many years ago. It's called Energy, Earth, and Everyone, a Global Energy Strategy for Spaceship Earth. And it's a tremendously ambitious documentation of many different attributes associated with society and the planet. And I just really recommend people getting this book and read it anyway to see how what we're talking about, how it's, first of all, it's not new. It's new in the sense that the public is not aware of the concept of having a systems approach to resources or the necessity of it. Most of the public is still locked into an ideological-based system. They still think in ideologies as far as socialism and communism and free markets and stuff like that. As we move forward, as I've said before, ideologies are going to become relatively obsolete because they don't, unless, of course, they have a relationship to the planet. And that's pretty much the only ideology that can truly be valid in regards to social management. And of course, educational imperatives are critical on another level, but I'm not going to go into that. So Energy, Earth, and Everyone. That's a great book. There's a foreword by Fuller, of course, and it's by Medard Gable. And let's see here. One final thing. In all my research for the new film, I've been stumbling upon some terrific quotes and some terrific personalities that in partnership, partnership, is that the right word? Well, I guess it could kind of work. In partnership with all the other third-party people that I've been researching, it all really creates a beautiful conglomerate of validation for what we're talking about. To clarify, let me just go ahead and express what I want to communicate here. There's a man named James Gilligan. He was a director at the Center for the Study of Violence at Harvard, but he's, of course, not a rigid academic, as he was also a prison psychiatrist for 25 years. And he talked to violent men, almost routine, and has an intimate first-hand knowledge of the issue of violence. Now, I think I might even have a question in my list today, but a common thing that's brought up when you talk about the movement or the Venus Project is people say, well, what about violence in association with jealousy, violence in association with various neuroses where people kill out of a personal ego reason, or people do, a lot of other violent acts too, but we'll use murder as a fundamental, murder and assault as a fundamental example here. At least that's what this quote pertains to. You hear this a lot. People say, well, what do we do about that? That's not monetary related. It's first important to point out that 90 to 95% of people in prison and people that commit some form of socially offensive act do it for money. The only important thing to point out to that, with that, is the fact that drug relationships, of course, are very dominant in our prison population, especially in America. I believe it's well over 50% of the American prison population, over 50%, are nonviolent drug offenders. Either they're selling drugs or they're caught using drugs. And drugs, of course, are a sickness. when people get addicted to these drugs, it becomes a mental health issue and a personal health issue, physiological health issue. It's not a criminal act. It's not socially offensive in the way that we consider most things. If you see a heroin addict on the street, they're not trying to rob or kill people. If they're extremely strung out and they have to do something to get their fix, then they might resort to such things. But that's a little bit of an aside. The causality is still based on a mental health, physiological health issue. Those issues being denoted, that 95% of all crime is either a mental health issue regarding drugs or it's monetary related. That is provable. Now, the other 5% become more complex. That's why I want to read this quote by this very experienced prison psychiatrist of 25 years. He states in regard to violent behavior and violent personalities he's dealt with, quote, "The prison inmates I work with have told me repeatedly when I asked them why they had assaulted someone that it was because they, quote, disrespected me, unquote, or, quote, he disrespected my visitor, unquote. The word disrespect is so central in the vocabulary, moral value system, and psychodynamics of these chronically violent men that they have abbreviated it into the slang term, he dissed me. I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed, and did not represent the attempt to prevent or undo his loss of faith, no matter how severe the punishment, even if it includes death. For we misunderstand these men at our peril if we do not realize they mean... I can't read today. For we misunderstand these men at our peril if we do not realize they mean it literally when they say they would rather kill or mutilate others or be killed or mutilate themselves than live without pride, dignity, and self-respect. They literally prefer death to dishonor." And what he's implying there, that's the end of the quote by James Gilligan. What it implies here is that there's a powerful environmental condition. There's a shame, respect issue that happens in society that's culminated, that's promulgated, that's perpetuated, and it carries over, and you can't just dismiss criminal behavior, in other words, because of this assumption that they are, quote, good or bad. There's a psychological attribute that's extremely powerful, and I think this type of testimony by prison psychologists really put things into perspective, which is why I wanted to bring that up. I'm not going to belabor it, but it's important to understand that experience is what drives our behavior. While there are genetic propensities, of course, as we've talked about many times, that can exaggerate certain behaviors, it's still the psychology. And if you have a culture of stratification where people are considered, people are put on a pedestal, some people are considered better than others, it's important to point out that it's as though there's a right to existence in the way our economic system works. It's like there's a right to life. Only certain people throughout time have had the right to live decent lives. First it was pharaohs and kings, and everyone else were peasants. And then society has slowly culminated a little bit more equality as resources and abundance have become more available. And now we today have the same paradigm, but it's a little bit more even than it was historically, I suppose, anyway, at least in the modern world of the past couple thousand years, where you have this massive social stratification where certain people are deserving of the rewards and fruits of modern technology, modern advancement, and then certain people are not deserving, evidently, where they can't eat. They're not deserving. And this goes to show that there's a tremendous value orientation that can come into play with oneself, a certain shame. I'm sure you guys heard about the people that would kill themselves rather than lose their jobs. There were people that were CEOs, wealthy people, that killed themselves because of how many people they had to lay off in their company. You've heard of course, people killing their entire families because they've lost their jobs. These patterns are there. So I just want to further reiterate the fact that these environmental issues have to be addressed. And if you address these environmental issues, if you get rid of the neuroses of the inherent disrespect, shame, and humiliation that's inherent in the system we have today, then you're going to see that 5% of violent crime drop dramatically. So I didn't explain all that very well, but I hope my end point is clear. That it's a chain reaction. And the first thing that has to happen is we have to equalize, and the monetary system has to go. And that's not even addressing the the dire psychological effects that will happen once scarcity starts to accelerate, which is the path we're on right now, if changes aren't made. So I think that's all of my that's all of my ramblings. Let's go into your questions. Question 1. I have talked to a bunch of people, and they often suggest monetary reform, like shutting down central banks, outlawing interest, and the fractional reserve system, going back to a gold standard or the greenback by Andrew Jackson. Aside from the displacement of people from labor, which cannot be addressed by these reforms, I would like to ask the other reasons what makes monetary reforms not a viable solution. Okay, so the question is, why don't we just reform the monetary system? I'd say there's maybe 3 attributes. The first is, even if you did all of these things, it would not change the fact that our entire economy is based on cyclical consumption. It's the foundation of the economic structure. The world economy can only work if goods and services are perpetually bought and sold, and the consequence of this is it generates contrived value systems and copious amounts of waste. Let me elaborate a little bit. I'd say the contrived value systems, meaning that people have been engineered into materialism. Don't think it's some natural byproduct, that some natural human element that we are, we want to have a bunch of stuff. That's not true at all. In fact, I've said this many times. America, for example, was based on more of a Puritan association. It was about utility. And it wasn't until after the First World War and after the Second World War that motivation was increased to create an artificial value system, if you will, based on marketing and consumption. I think George Carlin did a great job a few of his performances ago. Of course, he died, but he stated that the last remaining value of American culture is buying things. It's consumption, and that would serve the function that's required. Because in order for the economic system to work, as I've stated, you have to perpetually buy and consume. If people were satisfied with what they had, they wouldn't consume as much. If they had things that lasted, they wouldn't have to replace them. So the contrived value systems, which create copious amounts of waste through the propensity of cyclical consumption, the requirement of cyclical consumption, is not going to go away through monetary reform. And the real problem with that, ultimately, is the fact that we are wasting everything. The amount of waste is just unbelievable. I don't even know where to begin with that, but I'm going to leave it at that. That's just the first point I would make. I would say the second point I would make that isn't changed by what you talk about is the fact that the mechanism of self-interest and seeking differential advantage and hence gain at the expense and misery of others is still there. It might be a little bit less pressure, say, to remove interest, but the scarcity of money is still going to exist. It wouldn't be a monetary system if there wasn't a scarcity of money. It would be something else. It would be like energy credits. But anyway, so that's still there. So the corruption that you see doesn't change. The behavioral patterns of businesses, corporations, individuals to seek their dominance and to step on whoever they need to, which is a natural byproduct. Corruption is the basis of the system. The system is based on dishonesty. That's not going to change. The third issue, I would say, is that new problem-solving technologies, new advents, are paralyzed. They will be paralyzed, especially if they're very efficient, and that's what I mean anyway. The more new technologies that are efficient are going to be paralyzed if they challenge the established power structure. They'll be paralyzed until the market system can absorb the change. And what that means is that until the cartels and monopolies can get a hold of the new technology so they can continue to make their money, you're not going to see such progress. You're not going to see anything implemented. The medical establishment is a great example. In this system, it's a good thing to have 1 in 4 with cancer. The entire medical establishment thrives on it. The death of cancer patients equates to the life of thousands and thousands of people, if not millions, because of the way the establishment is set up. And the moment someone comes along with a new treatment that perhaps isn't invasive, perhaps doesn't involve radiation, it perhaps doesn't involve any type of anything that can be destructive as the techniques are today, that actually can save people, that will be silenced and stopped. In fact, I'm not going to go into it, but a good friend of mine has made a documentary on a particular individual who has a form of cancer treatment which is profound, and he's slowly getting into the airways. He was brought to the Texas Medical Board Supreme Court 6 times. They tried to put him in prison. The FDA tried to put him in prison. The National Cancer Society. There's so much corruption in regard to protecting the established order that's financially driven that the issues you talk about for reform might be good in transition, but they really change nothing as far as the underlying problems. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Fluid progress depends on it. And let me just add one more thing. The only way you're going to be able to stop war and the only way you're going to alleviate poverty is to declare all the world's resources as common heritage. And you can't do that within the monetary system. Until this is done, you're going to see further depressions, growing stratification, growing crime, and other neuroses generated from scarcity, inequality, and deprivation. Those attributes will not go away with any type of reform. Question 2. How specifically do you plan to allocate scarce resources that have alternative uses, especially since their use is largely subjective? When you eliminate cost, the demand for everything will be impossible to meet. Consumers, firms, factories, research institutions, hospitals will all request more goods, services, tools, instruments, materials, and equipment than we will be able to produce. So how specifically will you decide who gets their request honored and who will not? Okay, there's a lot of loaded attributes in that based on a particular perspective that I don't agree with. This is a common assumption. For we, often assume that the patterns of materialism and consumption will continue as they do today. We think that things will be in the future as they are today, and then we think that if everything's made available to everyone, then somehow it's going to create this hoarding mentality, and everyone's just going to want everything and everyone's just going to want a bunch of everything. The truth is actually the opposite as far as I'm concerned. When a resource-based economy is put into position, when everything is streamlined, consumption will decrease dramatically for a few reasons. One, as I stated before, the value manipulations are gone. In other words, advertising and the consumer culture will have no basis. We'll move from a world of vanity to a world of utility. And that doesn't mean art and creativity will not flourish. In fact, I suspect creative interests and invention will flourish beyond anything we've ever seen. Once people realize that they don't need money to pursue their interests, the values will change. The second point I like to make is that goods are created to last and to be updated, not perpetually replaced to feed cyclical consumption as we see today. So the longevity is paramount. The longevity of things will be unlike anything we've seen today as well, because there's no reason for planned obsolescence or the inherent obsolescence that comes with competition within a market system. I've explained that before. Basically, in order to produce anything and to have a competitive edge, you have to inherently limit quality. That's a direct byproduct. That's gone as well. So the turnover is cut dramatically, I'd say by 75%. I would also say that maybe 70% of the occupations and activities which consume most of the resources that we have, or consume, a lot of resources that are used today, will no longer exist because they'll serve no function. There's no retail offices, no accounting firms, Wall Street's gone, there's no banks. And once automation becomes, the focus of labor, once there's a deliberate interest to automate as much as technically feasible, then other institutions that utilize resources will vanish as well. Think about, just the transport of getting a person from their home to a job and the amount of energy wear and tear on their car, the amount of gasoline that's used. If you had, in fact, Buckminster Fuller had a funny comment once. I can't remember the exact comment, so if I state this wrong, I apologize. But basically, he was analyzing something. I think it was in New York City, and he analyzed what the output was of a particular section of employment, and he said, what? If these people just stayed home, it would be more productive because they wouldn't be wasting the energy on their meaningless activities. Continuing, I would say that third point, there's no property and the system is based around access, which means duplication is cut to a dramatic degree. Using the example of a car, this means at least a 60% reduction in the use of cars holistically, as they're shared, not owned. It's a very important distinction. I mean, it's, in a primitive gesture, I'd say that access becomes similar to how you engage a library. If you need a camera, you check it out. It is the best camera that can possibly be made at that point in time, and the most versatile, and use the most advanced materials, has the highest form of endurance. And the issue of style and taste, again, which is perpetuated by the advertising community to get you to feel like there's a cultural significance or a personal identification, this constant manipulation, as I've said before, people that walk around with logos on their shirt, they walk around with Prada bags and Rolex watches, they actually think that means something important. They actually think that they're defined in some way. And the sick thing is they actually are, because there is a class system, but the class system is absolutely artificial, generated to serve the function of the established orthodoxy. So next time you see somebody with high-end stuff or sporting a logo, you might want to explain to them that all they are a free walking advertisement for the corporation that created those products. They've done a very good job to do that. Nike and Polo, and it's fascinating. Tommy Hilfiger, people actually wear these clothes with the logos on them, and they actually think it's cool, and they don't realize that they're a walking prostitute without even knowing it. So anyway, where was I? I was talking about how, yes, resource allocation. I think it's let me just summarize. The resource-based economy is streamlined conservation. Streamlined conservation. And it's that conservation mechanism, in part, that will allow for the abundance of necessities. One more little example. We import things from all over the world in America because of slave labor, usually. So we go to Ecuador, and we pay the Ecuadorians $1 a day to pick bananas and cultivate bananas, and then we put them in vehicles that require energy, usually fossil fuels, and we transport them all the way back to the United States. What a tremendous waste. We have a dispersion of industry where it's just all over the globe. You have all this import and export. You have resources everywhere that are hoarded. You have a non-streamlined system. What's going to happen in the future is you're going to have what I'd say a localized establishment. In other words, when you live in a city system, everything you need is, if possible, is culminated right there in the city system. There's no reason to import anything except raw materials that are required that cannot be obtained in your current region. If you need a certain type of metal that only exists in abundance in Africa, that's where the dominant mining is, and you are in America, well, we're faced with the challenge of making sure those materials make it to manufacturing facilities, and you keep everything streamlined and local. You wouldn't have a circumstance in the future where you have factories in Kansas that have to move materials down to over to Ohio, and then all the way down to Florida to be packaged, and then up to Wisconsin for distribution. None of that will exist. And if you think about how much resources are wasted on that, how much time is wasted on that, it's unbelievable. So I'm going to leave it at that. Number 3. Hi, Peter. Do you think it's a good idea to have many thousands, if not millions, of websites with the Zeitgeist Movement videos and links pointing to Z-Day 2010, pointing to the Z-Day 2010 site on all these websites? I understand that the more sites that have links to a particular site, the more that particular site is presented in search engine results. Again, back to the press issue, I am going to have to really push this more so. I really want everyone out there to do anything they can. One small contribution. Everyone listening, do something. Put up a YouTube video. Put an ad in a newspaper for your local event. Do something subtle. It doesn't have to be massive. It doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars. You don't have to take out TV space, though. If you have public broadcasting access, that's a great idea. So yes, I completely think that people should be doing anything they can, and obviously search engines are important. It'd be great to search Zeitgeist Day or Z-Day and have thousands of returns from all over the world. And that's going to add a lot of precedence, and it's going to add a great history to the event. We want to make sure that this event isn't fly-by-night, and that there's a residue, if you will. There's an echo of this that's going to carry over with new people. So do whatever you can to promote this stuff. This is a very critical period. Number 4, in the event of someone acting in an aberrant way, maybe killing out of jealousy, I heard you say this person would be, quote, re-educated or helped. If there is no establishment, who decides this person needs re-education? If the subject refuses to cooperate, who will force him or her to get help? Okay, I think you haven't fully researched some of the angles, some of the material that we have where we talk about these issues. I want to go ahead and just throw right out there that the term re-education is loaded with massive historical bias. First of all, there's no such thing as re-education. There's only education. It moves in one direction. There can be poor education. It's still education nevertheless. So if you've been grossly informed about something and somebody brings new information to light, that's just continuing the educational process, and you move past your initial ignorance and you can continue to progress. So let's get rid of the word re-education. This is an old notion that people associate with Lenin and Stalin, or I believe anyway, in communism, where you're thrown into re-education camps. There's nothing like that, where you're creating value systems to serve the state in an arbitrary sense. So anyway, I know that's not your point, but let me continue. Regarding such crimes that you're talking about, as I kind of mentioned earlier in the broadcast, they're dealt with in the similar way that we deal with them today during our transition. We're not talking about waking up one day without our patchwork institutions as we have today, such as police and laws and government. That's not just going to happen overnight. I think people have misinterpreted Jacques Fresco a little bit when he says no police, no prisons. He's talking about a future ideal. He's talking about a position where you really can, I really believe you can get to a point where they're virtually non-existent. It's very difficult to think about right now, so I'm not going to even give that type of hypothetical. What I'm going to say is that the intent and problem-solving methodology that we will utilize will get to the root of the issues, not just patch them up. 95% of most crime, as I stated, is really going to be gone after the monetary system is removed. The other 5%, which engage in ego and neuroses-based offensive acts, would have to be handled in a similar way that we have now. Only this time we don't just lock them up in concrete cells with the old good and bad religious distinction, which really creates worse criminals if you track this type of behavior, track this type of practice. Human behavior is a mental health issue, and people with distorted values and violent schizotypal behavior will be treated with care and learned from as best we can. There will be police, if you will, in the transition, of course. There has to be. Our society today is far too distorted and conditioned to make some leap where magically you end up with a new system. I think everyone knows that. But there will be dramatically fewer police as things move forward. If you can remove 90-95% of most, quote, crime because of the monetary system, that equates to removal of 90% of most police. With that number getting less and less as time goes on and problems are solved. Going back to the quote I made by James Gilligan regarding his research and the need for value shifts, so people do not feel humiliated by society, they do not feel inferior by society, which is what this society perpetuates. It's a form of the sickness of incentive that we've culminated. Once times move forward and these things are resolved, less and less police, less and less institutions that have to deal with housing people to treat them. Another example I'd like to use in regard to murder is that the pattern will become so rare. It's not the pattern that's rare. The act will become rare. The pattern will diminish. I think I made this example before. You have people that engage in very sick neuroses today, things that we consider to be even much more sick than just murder itself, such as necrophilia. Necrophilia does not happen very often. It's a very, very rare thing. And in time, as we move forward, murder itself will become just as rare as necrophilia is today. It will be considered just as offensive as necrophilia is today. It's a transitional aspect, and I hope that that's clear. It's not that we just wake up one day and all this stuff is gone. There's going to have to be some type of enforcement issue as we continue our transition. But if you reduce by 90%, you're looking at just a breath of fresh air of a new world. So I won't belabor that anymore. Number 5. Filmmaking will change drastically in a resource-based economy. I work in this industry and I like horror films. Will horror films be allowed in the new society, or will they be considered an unnecessary, aberrant behavior-promoting medium? Okay. There's no such censorship. While it is provable that the glorification of violence can lead people to violent acts, the real problem isn't that perception, that influence. Excuse me. The real problem is the individual that has such a powerful lack of self-identity and lack of self-sufficiency that they're so influenced by these abstractions that they get the idea to go out and repeat what they've seen. There are, of course, a history of serial killers, but if you were to compare the number of serial killers to the number of horror films that have been created, which are, exaggerated violence, usually, the relationship's very thin. It goes back to the Columbine massacre kids. There was a gaming mentality that existed in what they did. There was an obvious romanticism that was generated, but this was coming from a particular type of sickness. It's few and far between. So to answer your question very simply, there's no censorship. However, I think the focus of creation will be different. Since the monetary system is removed, the need for sensationalism and repetition to gain people's attention to pull in more money will disappear. I'm sure everyone notices the nostalgia in Hollywood. They make the same films over and over and over again, either immediately and directly, like, how many times can they make Batman? Or they make films that are just mirrors of other films. How many love story relationship films can we possibly see with the exact same recipe? It's there because of familiarity. It's there because of an identification, an association. And people just go and fall in those loops. I think there'll be tremendous progress in film and media in general. There'll be more experimentation, and there'll be a much wider palette of disciplines, if you will, of mediums, I suppose is the best word, of expression. So I hope that answers your question. Again, censorship, I don't think that's an issue. And again, there's no overarching body to do that. For someone to create a film, they have to do it on their own. They do it with the resources that are provided, and it's given to the public. And I think once that aspect is in play, the motivations will change dramatically. And we'll move away, most probably, from the violence and sex-based stuff that we see every single day. Not to mention the materialism, which is either directly or indirectly culminated because of the need to sell things. But I'm not going to belabor that. I already kind of talked about that. Okay, let's see. Your number 6. Here's a cynical one. Number 6, this movement is looking more like a religion by the day. We have no evidence that this works, and everyone accepts it on faith alone. It has never been tested, and individual thinking is discouraged as you don't want anybody doing any activism under the Zeitgeist name because you're looking at the big picture and you want to start with education and creating awareness first, which basically consists of proselytizing people to your movies and the movement. What is your response to this? All right, that's a very narrow question. Let me kind of go point by point. You state that the movement looks like a religion. It's based on faith and it's never been tested. Well, first of all, I'm just going to call out that it's cute you call it a religion. I love how every time a new group comes around that's interested in something, the first knee-jerk reaction, the first knee-jerk debasing reaction comes in the form of calling it a cult or religion. This is something that we'll continually get. Of course, it's powerfully idiotic to think of it that way because, first of all religions and all cults have, by definition, have an attribute that isn't tangible, usually theistic-oriented. The cult of equinoctial Christianity, Scientology, with I'm not even going to go through the list, but what we're talking about is proven methods that can be put together in a systems approach and used as a whole to make life better for people. As far as, has it been tested? Every attribute that we talk about isn't new. We're basing everything on simple proven methodologies. I wish you could be more specific on what attribute you think has not been tested. The only thing that I would say hasn't been, quote, tested is the systems implementation in the city system, which, again, as you might know, we've been talking about for a while. We want to build a test city to experiment with certain things and also show the public what can be done. One thing we do know is that we have to have a systems approach to the planet. There's no testing required to understand that. The systems approach to the planet is the only way you can understand what the Earth has and how to use it. As I denoted in my lecture in Iowa, Part 2, Planet Earth, Project Earth, I go through the simple logic that unfolds the need for the system we need to employ. It has nothing to do with testing because we know this can be done. I've even given examples of Hewlett-Packard that has a, quote, central nervous system concept they want to implement with sensors, ubiquitous sensors all on the planet for various environmental reasons. There's no reason that can't be expanded to include everything in some form with redundancy going into a central system that is visible to everyone. There's no reason for secrecy. So let me go back to your question. Yeah, I'm just going to have to ask you, if you are listening, if you say it's never been tested, you have to be more specific, because a resource-based economy is based on a combination of attributes. A systems approach, resource management, the use of technological development for automation to displace labor deliberately. Why? Not only because it frees humanity, but because we know statistically that the more automation, the more mechanization in every field, the better progress, the more progress is generated. This isn't just some idea. This has been proven. So the only variable question mark has to do with where we might go with artificial intelligence in a more constructive way. And that's really not even necessary to consider. Systems approach, resource management, all there is energy, materials, and human ingenuity in the mind. The other attribute is education. We've got to get people educated out of the current value system so they understand their relationship to the environment, so they can focus their energy on things that actually matter, that have a social relevance or a personal relevance, not going into a 9 to 5. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. So please be specific next time you want to ask such a narrow question. Number 7. Oh, actually, hold on. I think I missed half the question. The Zeitgeist name. First of all, we're not trying to proselytizing people of the movies and the movement. No, we're not. The movies are irrelevant. They're tools. The movement exists on its own. As far as education, that's the largest thing that's the most difficult thing we have to do. I have no worries about the technological aspect. As far as the Zeitgeist name, I don't want people to pollute the Zeitgeist name, the Venus Project name, or the resource-based economy name with ideas that are not relevant. Building some commune, as we've denoted many, many times. Building a city that's based on survival, in other words, people living there as a detached form, is the wrong direction. So I'm not even going to go into all of that or give any more time to that question. Number 7. Hello, Mr. Joseph. I have talked to a bunch of people and they often suggest monetary... Whoa, hold on. Sorry about that. Wrong page turn. Number 7, can we talk about possible transition scenarios without talking about calamities and catastrophes? Good question. If the government wanted to help, say, we'll just say the United States, if there were transition scenarios that were not based on collapse, they would work like this. First of all, you'd have the government recognize that we have to move out of fossil fuels immediately, and they would nationalize programs. They would make national programs that would immediately do research and implement them as fast as possible. In order to do that, you'd have to bypass the free market. They would also shorten the workday. So you have what is really maybe about 20%, 18-20% unemployment in America. The 10-11% thing that they're showing now is only a fraction because they're not taking into account many other attributes, such as those that are off the record, those that are only halfway employed, those that are underemployed because they're cutting pay scales and they can barely work. You couple this all together, and there's some statistics that are out there that can culminate this better than what I'm explaining. But nevertheless, we have a tremendous growing unemployment problem. What would be done with that is certain industries would be nationalized, and they would bring in, they would implement a rule that each corporation had to have their work days, so people would go in for 4 hours a day, and someone else would come in with the same position for the other 4 hours. That's what they were talking about during the Roosevelt administration. That would be an idea. They also set up mass social programs to feed the poor You would have the United Nations not worrying about bickering over the things that they do bicker about, and this rhetoric they use regarding poverty and the resolution of armaments. They don't do anything. If they wanted to do something, they would constrict industries, resources, and corporations, and they would set up institutions that produce food. They would set up desalination plants in every form possible along the coasts of Africa. They would be putting in programs that would move forward to proper resource management and conservation and technological ingenuity. But none of this is going to happen without a collapse, I'm sorry to say. It's not that we want to talk about calamities and catastrophes. There's 2 points to it. First, the value system of most of the people in the world is basically of a free market mentality, generally speaking. Even the most socialist countries are still based on the incentive of money, and they really, if you go out and survey people and you ask them what they would propose as a solution to having money as a substitute for money, they'd probably look at you very confused. So in order to get the public to wake up to the problems that are in existence, they're going to have to experience problems. It's called biosocial pressures. And as far as the system itself, the only way, I'm sorry to say, you're going to see a transition out of the system is when there's no other choice. There's no other choice either based on powerful public social activism, which I am in support of, which we don't have the numbers to do yet, or a serious environmental problem that forces the hand, which pushes aside the monetary interests. That's really all I can say about that. There are many things that can be done, and I'm going to talk about a lot of this stuff in the new film. It really takes the awareness of the governments in a holistic sense to know what direction to move into, and the only way that can be honest, the only way that can be productive is if the monetary interest and incentive and establishment orthodoxy is stopped. And the odds of that happening in a fluid fashion are very, very slim. Number 8. What is your take on energy economics, and what role do you think it can have in a Venus Project society? I've been reading up on this, and to me it seems like a perfect way to measure units of resources and services. I know you keep saying that we should abolish monetary values, and I agree, but an energy accounting system would be strictly speaking not be subject to the notion of value, and I think therefore it would bypass many of the negatives of the monetary system. I say this because I think people in any society need to be able to see the overall economy and where everything goes to know how everything works and fits together. The energy economics point you make, I'm not sure if you're referencing a particular website. What you denote reminds me of the early technocracy ideas with energy certificates. So, and I can see the merit of that. I can see the importance of making a relationship to the environment, running it through a mathematical model, and providing everyone on the planet with a certain amount of energy in the form of certificates that are literally untradeable. They are designated only to the individual. I can see the merit in that, but I also think that it's not necessary. It's not necessary for many reasons. In transition, it could be beneficial, especially in regions that become more isolated if they break off. But if you streamline society and deliberately do so for conservation and abundance, and then once the value systems have been dispersed that have been perpetuating materialism and constant consumption for the need of cyclical consumption, for the need of economic circulation to maintain GDP and social stability, once those attributes are removed, I really don't think it's necessary to have that type of accounting system. It gets in the way. I think people can have access, and we believe that people will understand their access, and society will change radically. The notion of property will become utterly obsolete. They won't want to be in one place. People will explore the planet. People will travel. So I would have to look again at what the specifics are that you're talking about based on the reference you're making called energy economics. I apologize I didn't look that up. But the notion of value, I think, should maintain obsolescence apart from the fact of scarcity. And the approach to value and scarcity isn't that it's just given a higher value. It's that substitutions are immediately put into practice and are immediately sought. It's an active system. So I hope that makes sense. I think I could clarify my statements a little bit more on that one, but I don't want to spend too much time. I think giving people the right to access is going to be just as powerful more powerful than having something like energy certificates. And as far as transparency, you say, I think, therefore, it would bypass many of the negatives in the monetary system. I say this because I think people would need to be able to see the overall economy and where everything goes. Well, yes. Instead of seeing the economy quote where the certificates or money goes, which I'm assuming you're relating to, they would see where resources are. They would understand. Everyone would have access to all the planetary resources statistics. The transparency would be there for everyone, and that's really critical too, because people can understand their relationship. When people go into school, in elementary school, the teachers sit them down and say, boom, here's our planet. This is planet Earth, and here's where all the resources that your daily life consists of. And here's why we have to conserve them. Here's why we use these particular strategies. Here's why we've set this up. The systems approach will be immediately in education, so people understand what the hell the planet is, how you relate to it, how it's set up, and why. Once that value system is installed, a natural sense of conservation, a natural sense of respect will materialize, unlike anything we've seen today in the materialistic, self-preserving culture. So a little bit of a tangent, but I hope that helps for those that were wondering about any of those issues. Number 9. Peter, as the movement expands, the need for theoretical guidance will grow. We may not know the exact way to make a transition, but we can scientifically prove which ways are not going to work. One of the wrong concepts is that through building many fancy cities all over the world, the system is going to collapse and we will turn the world into a resource-based economy. Through science, we must show which concepts are wrong. Then everybody will focus on the human being, on the development of science and technology, and their application for social concern. Well, I agree with you. Building cities is not going to change anything except give a little bit more education to the public at large about what can be done in a holistic systems approach. So I completely agree with you. As far as expanding the need for theoretical guidance, well, I think we've stated quite a bit on the overall theory, not only theory, but overall examples, implementation examples that are already in existence. So I think you've answered your own question. I guess that really wasn't a question at all. Number 10. Mr. Joseph, have you considered ever writing a book? This would be an excellent medium in pushing the movement to a more specific academic atmosphere, and wouldn't you think it's prudent to attracting people from the academic world to support our movement? I haven't considered writing a book. We live in a digital culture these days. There are a lot of tremendous books out there that have a lot of good insight that get shelved. Some of the books on Jacques Fresco's reading list are just so incredible that I recommend everyone going there and reading them. But the real influence now, the real medium of expression is film. So I'm focusing on that. Writing a book, who knows? Maybe in the future. The 83-page companion guide could be considered a book of sorts. I've had ideas of expanding that substantially. All of my lectures could be comprised into documents. As far as a publishing book versus a digital book, I don't know. There's certain merits to something being, in stores, but then again, that's a different point. I'll consider something like that. I think Jacques Fresco's done a very good job of his book. That's a great primer on all the ideas. So, who knows? I don't rule anything out. I'm focusing on films right now because it's the most immediate and effective medium I think there is. Hi, Peter. My question concerns technological development and humans' motivation. A lot of great leaps forward in technology have been due in part to war, i.e. the space race, V2 technology, radar satellite, and scarcity, such as agriculture, fossil fuels, where warmth is scarce in cold climates. War is based on scarcity and acquisition. However, this may be manufactured or dressed up in political or religious guises, right? By contrast, self-sustaining cultures where there have been more or less permanent abundance, they have developed much more slowly, such as tribes of Borneo and the Amazon rainforests, who remain pretty much unchanged to this day. How do you think a resource-based economy with abundance would motivate people to maintain the current rate of technological development? I know that the current system holds development back in many ways if it doesn't involve profit or war posturing. NASA's funding is a case in point. what do you think the people of the future's intrinsic and extrinsic motivators will be? Let's see. Okay, incentive. Yes, problems create creativity. I totally agree with that. There have been a lot of tremendous solutions because of problems. First, I'd like to say that problems are not going away. There are always going to be problems. There's going to be disease problems. There's going to be technical problems. There are going to be resource problems which require solutions constantly. There's always going to be problems that address solutions. Therefore, there's always going to be an interest to solve them. I think that the phenomenon of what we've seen with technological development, using the military as an example, where it employs tons of scientists under a despotic motivation to create new technologies to use for the wrong purposes, while I see how it moves things forward, I don't really think that in the future we are going to have to rely on such pressures or the incentive of money. In regard to the notion of cultures, small cultures in the Amazon, I think it's difficult to make those comparisons because they're so isolated. Those cultures are very isolated, and they literally exist in a kind of stuck-in-time world. We've set in motion the Western world, the world as a whole. Most of the people on the planet are involved in general technological advancement one way or another. They utilize new technologies to ease their lives, cell phones, etc. And I think that trend is going to continue as things become easier. As the interest to make things easier grows. What's a good example of this? Let me think. For example, we have a plane. The plane, when it was first invented, was amazing. You didn't have to ride on cars and trains anymore. The plane was much faster than anything that had existed prior, and it's unfortunately a gas-guzzling plane. It does a lot of pollution. To now, we don't even need the plane. We have maglev trains which can utilize 2% of the energy that's required for plane travel. Maglev trains can go underwater. They can be utilized above and below ground. You can create massive hubs that move at 2,000 to 4,000 miles per hour from hub to hub, and it would completely make the plane obsolete. This is a problem that's solved. People would say, well, what can we do better? There will always be the question of what can we do better. And I think even indigenous cultures, if you went to them and you showed them something new, they might pick it up and want to develop it and move forward with it. It also has to do with influence and creativity. It has to do with discovery. We discover lots of interesting things, nanotechnology, where there's a mimicking of the human body as we've analyzed, of the cellular structures, the nanomachines that are in our bodies that kind of run the show, that repair aspects of our body without us being conscious of it. There's always going to be that type of give and take. There's always going to be that influence. There's always going to be that creativity. There's always going to be that development. Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, these were people that were genuinely interested in progress and moving forward with brilliant ideas that might help society. The pattern, I think, is quite clear. And while I do agree with what you're saying, in general, meaning I do believe there is an incentive that has emerged in the past, I do believe the problem incentive will disappear and people will want to just make things better and better and better. And of course, it won't be fanatical either. It won't be, if society can reach a point of balance where we're still progressing, of course, but it's not as cutthroat as it is today, I say that's all the better. There isn't a more cultural aspect to be perpetuated. I don't like that at all. Except in the sense of creating better methodologies and better systems, not the more and more that we see today with the materialism and consumption. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here because your question actually makes me think a lot. To completely summarize, I don't believe the motivation issue is going to be impeded by allowing people the necessities of life and the freedom away from drudgery. I think that people are intrinsically curious. They develop motivation. A little baby likes to discover new things. It goes through life, and it's pretty much stripped of its curiosity as it's conditioned into a specific educational, usually academic niche, and then eventually they find their slot in the labor force of the social architecture. That will no longer exist. So to answer your question, what do you think people of the future's intrinsic and extrinsic motivators will be? It'll be to make things better in whatever way they can, along with a lot of the other things that we've talked about, to conserve the resources, to have a mutual respect, to really understand the natural world, science and technology, And I'm just going to have to leave it at that. That's something for a much larger discussion because there's a lot of other avenues that could be relayed. Number 12, hello, Peter. I understand your hesitation in engaging the lecture team as we wish to prevent others from getting the wrong idea. However, I have been studying and debating this information with many people, and I feel I can offer a clear and concise picture of what we advocate. I have defended our position from hardcore Christians to extreme Republicans and everything in between, and I feel that the best thing I can do to help the movement is to spread the information. Any thoughts on where other lecturers besides you and Mr. Fresco will be able to do their thing? Well, the lecture team, I was just talking about this the other day in the state chapters meeting. The lecture team is being developed, and I'm going to start creating a mailing list database and a section, maybe even a part of the Zeitgeist Media Project, maybe not, I'm not quite sure yet. We just have to find a way to interview people, if you will, and give them a sort of test, if you will, to just see how educated they are and if they can handle some of the more complex questions that are thrown at them. I think a great experiment for all of you out there that have an interest in this, if you feel like you can go in front of a crowd and speak and do it in a way that's concise, have a PowerPoint presentation, is to record yourself doing this for Zeitgeist Day in your location and put it up online and send it to me. Because I definitely want to see. Some people in the UK did this. It was great to see. I want to see people just go out and start doing it. And then those that I feel are strong, that that are doing a good job and are expanding the information, then there can be a meeting. And I'd like to actually have a meeting at the Venus Project with Jacques, with those that feel they can represent correctly, and Jacques can talk more so. Maybe it can even be a webcast of sorts, a web meeting where Jacques can talk to them about specific issues and questions they might have, more complex questions. An interaction will emerge, I guarantee you. It's just not been on my list of priority because we have so many other things to deal with. But I do hope very much to see many of you out there giving talks, and record everything, please, and put everything online. We'll try to make a post-event webpage with as much media as possible from all events. Use Ustream as well, so I'm just going to leave it at that. You'll hear more about that, and it's going to be an interview process and examination process, about the best way I can describe it. Number 13. Jacques talks often about bringing a human being to their highest potential. My question is, how do you bring a person to his or her highest potential? What environment do you have to bring it up in? That's an interesting question. Well, first of all, highest human potential would be a temporal disposition, just as I use the term peak efficiency. If you're going to build a computer, you would use the best of the best components, the highest amount of everything that you're using. In other words, the enclosure would be made out of a very, very powerful material. You would use the best underlying resources for the component parts, and you would hope to make a system that can be updated, but can also be operate at the most peak efficient position as technologically possible at that point in time. I hope that makes sense. Computer's a little more complex, a bit complex of an example. If you have, we'll just use a simple example of a telephone. You would make the telephone the absolute best as you can at that point in time. So that applies to the human being as well. So the potential of the human being would be based on relevant education, meaning the most important subjects a human being should know in existence on this planet, with certain focuses, on certain industries. We want people to be, not industries, but certain sectors of interest. I keep using these words that are monetary oriented, so please ignore that. A human being's highest potential is understanding what there is to know at that point in time. The only way we can do this really is through the implementation of computers for interaction, such as like Wolfram Alpha and these other subtle artificial intelligence, operations that are coming forward. So I'm not really sure I answered your question otherwise. You bring people to their highest potential by giving them relevant information, giving them information that's actually useful. You don't give them fantasies. And you hope that they continue to learn on their own, and whenever they think, they're thinking in the clearest possible way they They really can. And the only way that can honestly happen is through interaction with database information. That's what I think is going to happen. We already do that now, so don't be in fear of that. If someone wants to learn about something, usually they jump into a search engine. Very few people pick up an encyclopedia these days, or they go to Wikipedia or whatever. So you begin, your interaction with information is very predominant now, and it's going to get much more dramatic, I think, as time moves forward. That's going to be a big component of people's decision-making processes. Number 14, since education and awareness of the environment are primary principles of the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project, do you address the concept of readily accessible food until the concept of a city? Until the concept of a city, if you wanted meat, you had to go out and hunt the animal, kill it, clean it, prepare it, and cook it. There were no refrigerators for storage either. This maintained a balance with nature and discouraged overconsumption. Currently, people want the meat, but want to leave the dirty business of killing to someone else, leaving them far removed from nature. Will maintaining balance with nature be focused on more so than readily accessible food, which panders to the very consumption that led to the downfall of the society to begin with? The caveat to what you describe is really the value systems and understanding the environment. Hunters and gatherers did have a natural balance because they had natural limitations with the environment. Before the agricultural revolution, it was a very different world. Very different world. There's a lot to be said on that as well, as far as the merits versus one or the other. But we've already set this in motion. We have the ability to control our environment, and that's really what you're talking about. We want to create an educational structure where people understand what they're doing with the environment and with each other and with themselves. So that's really what it comes down to. It's educational. The balance will come from practice and come from systems that are generated from objective arrivals. That's a terrible sentence. Systems where we have arrived at decisions in a proper way, such as, again, I really like the example I use at the Iowa lecture about arriving at decisions of distribution, arriving at decisions of statistical patterns of consumption to make sure necessities are available for people. People are provided with their necessities in a way where it's built in that the mechanisms of conservation and balance, as you put it, are there. It's built in. That's why we want the systems approach that we have. And it's naturally compensating as well. Granted, it's not going to be absolutely perfect. There's no such thing. But it would be a whole lot better than what we have. And the methodology is really what's important. And as long as we have respect for the methodology, then we're going to be fine. So I hope that answers your question. I see your point, and that's a very interesting point. But I think the real issue is the systems approach to maintain the balance. I've coupled in with educational orientation where people don't have the need for excess as they do today. And even if certain neurotic mentalities came forward where they wanted excess, those few that demand excess, and I'm throwing this out there, I don't think this would be common, can have their excess because it's not going to interfere with someone else. That's in transition for those that are really indoctrinated into their hypermaterialism that you see today. Number 15. Hi, Peter. On the January 12th episode of the Colbert Report, they had Raj Patel as a guest. He was selling a book called The Value of Nothing. I love that sentence. He was selling a book called The Value of Nothing. That's good. He continues. In the interview, he talked about how free markets, quote, hide the real costs of the way we consume today, unquote, and that, quote, we need different ways of valuing the world other than relying on free markets, unquote. When Colbert asked the question, quote, what's the alternative to free markets, unquote, Raj gave a vague description of a true democracy where government would be controlled by 600 random citizens. He didn't mention what would be replacing the economy at all, and he didn't mention the movement. Anyway, my question to you is this. If Stephen Colbert is open-minded enough to have someone like this on the show, do you think that he would have you or Jacques on to talk about the movement? It would be a great way to inform the mainstream public about the movement, for sure. I like Stephen Colbert. It's really a shame that a lot of the more important media and more important news stories and things come from these comedy shows. It's hilarious to me that we've reached this backwards paradigm where people go to these shows like The Daily Show and the Colbert Report, and they actually get better information than they do from the mainstream, which is literally the pattern that I've seen in part. Part of my hesitation with this is it is a joke show, and what we talk about is very serious. But obviously, if Jacques or I were invited, by all means, we would go. I would be happy to entertain that. As far as getting on the show, that's a whole different thing. I don't have an agent. Jacques doesn't have an agent. We do have campaigns for our communications team to write anyone and everyone. There's a form letter on the website that needs to be updated. I think after Zeitgeist Day, we might have a higher probability of getting forefront figures onto some of these shows, and I really hope that that happens. So, yes, by all means, I would be happy to participate in any of those shows. Number 16. Hi, Peter. Hope you're well. Since discovering the movement, I have spent a great deal of time learning the material and spreading the word. I have noticed, like you, that I keep getting the same responses over and over as time goes on, and I have gotten better responding to these criticisms. However, I hit a stumble block on the response that I am just being, quote, brainwashed. How do you, or would you respond to this comment? Okay. They just call you brainwashed? Is that what you're saying? Well, if that's all they can say, then they're not really doing anything. If you get generalized reactions, then you have to stop them and say, well, in what sense, in what category? Please define your terms. Please give an example. You have to qualify everything. So people's terminology is, of course, very twisted. Obviously, brainwashed, though, so you're just indoctrinated into the Zeitgeist religion. That has no basis. It has no historical precedent. We're not preaching any type of behavior. We're trying to readjust society in a positive way, holistically through technology and science. It's that simple. I find it very difficult. You'll find anyone that you run into that demeans us in such a way that they're just dismissal, and it's often not worth wasting your time. If someone says you're brainwashed, say, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. I think you're the one who's brainwashed. And there's your nice reciprocated statement that leaves it up in the air. That's fine. In fact, I wouldn't even say that. I wouldn't even reciprocate whatsoever, come to think of it. I'm trying to give you something better to go on than with these responses I'm making, because I've encountered this so much. That type of denial is so frustrating because it's just an ultimate dismissal. Just move on in that event. Just say, I'm sorry you feel that way, and move on. People have to ask real questions. If they don't ask you real questions, then they're not interested in real answers. And often, of course, they don't know the question, so you have to help them with the right question, too. So keep that in mind. People say, who makes the decisions in a resource-based economy? You say, it's not about who makes the decisions, it's by what methodology or decisions arrived at. It's a loyalty not to peoples or groups or ideologies. It's a loyalty to methodologies that have stood the test of time. Number 17. What does the Venus Project hope to do about the peak oil problem? I'm well aware of the other energy alternatives to generate electricity, such as geothermal and tidal. But what would generate things made more directly from oil, such as plastic, carpets, batteries? What of ships that transport goods? How would they be powered in the future if a maglev train was not yet available? Oil just seems to be so interconnected, and I would like to know if the Venus Project has any solution to this particular issue. Thanks. Good question. This is something that we're going to talk about at Zeitgeist Day 2010. I'm sure many people out there saw the movie Collapse, which was a good treatment. The other things I could say that I think were problematic, but overall it's a very good awakening film to shake people up a little bit about where we are. The establishment has created a world, an edifice built upon fossil fuels. Our entire society is based on this source of non-renewable energies. So the solutions come in many different angles. First, it's conservation. Like you talk about transport of ships. We're going to reduce a tremendous amount of transport in the future because we're going to localize things based on city systems, based on integrated city systems that stretch multiple cities, if you will. There's no reason to have the tremendous amount of transport we see today. People will not have to move around as much as they do. Will not have to go into a day job every day and get locked onto a highway burning fossil fuels just sitting there. I've already discussed a few attributes of the conservation aspect that's built into the system, which will be a heavy component to provide the abundance. But as far as plastics, carpets, batteries, these issues can we already know we can create plastics through other forms that are actually decompose. The problem is the implementation. It's not that the technologies aren't there to create plastics out of something beyond fossil fuels. It's that the infrastructure required to put that into practice would take so much energy and so much of it would take such a change to the establishment structure that you're not going to see it happen overnight in a monetary system. You have to think what it's going to be like in the system to understand how easy it would be to move away from the peak oil problem. We need the rest of the oil on the planet to begin the transition. That's what I will say definitively. That is the point. We have to do something to stop the outrageous waste of this resource and use what's left to provide the world with new infrastructure. In fact, you know what? I just realized something. I was looking at a book. It was actually Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth. I was just in a section. Give me 1 second. And Fuller makes a tremendously important point about our use of fossil fuel deposits. 1 second. There it is. Just open right to it. Here we go. Here's what Buckminster Fuller has to say about our transition. Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, page 111. Quote, "The fossil fuel deposits of our spaceship Earth correspond to our automobile storage battery. When he refers to automobile, he refers to spaceship Earth, by the way. Continuing, which must be conserved to turn over our main engine's self-starter." He's being metaphoric still. "Therefore, our, quote, main engine, unquote, the life-regenerating processes must operate exclusively on our vast daily energy income from the powers of wind, tide, water, and the direct sun radiation energy. The fossil fuel savings account have been put aboard Spaceship Earth for the exclusive function of getting the new machinery built with which to support life and humanity at ever more effective standards of vital physical energy and re-inspiring metaphysical sustenance." By the way, he used the term metaphysical in a very different context. "Re-inspiring metaphysical sustenance to be sustained exclusively on our sun's radiation and moon pool gravity's tidal, wind, and rainfall generated pulsating and therefore harnessable energies. The daily income energies are excessively adequate for the operation of our main industrial engines and their automated productions. The energy expended in 1 minute of a tropical hurricane equals the combined energy of all the USA and USSR nuclear weapons. Only by understanding this scheme may we continue for all time ahead to enjoy and explore a universe as we progressively harness ever more of the celestially generated tidal and storm-generated wind, water, and electrical power concentrations. We cannot afford to expend our fossil fuels faster than we are, quote, recharging our battery, unquote, which means precisely the rate at which the fossil fuels are being continually deposited within the Earth's spherical crust." End quote of the Fuller quote. In other words, what he's saying is that we have to use fossil fuels to build a new society. And I completely agree with that. And that's really where we're at with this issue. I have absolutely no, and I talked to Jacques about this, the transition's the problem. It's not the fact that there's no other substitutes. There's plenty of substitutes for everything we use fossil fuels for, from many different angles. The problem is the current monetary establishment is built upon fossil fuels. All of the production methods of various industries come from hydrocarbon energies. So it's going to take a utter revision of society as a whole, and when it comes to production and distribution, to get rid of this phenomenon. Not to mention the extremely tragic understanding that there's going to be billions of dollars that's going to be made as the society collapses. Fossil fuels will increase in value more and more and more, fossil energies, because they are going to grow scarce. If they don't grow scarce in 20 years, it doesn't matter. If they grow scarce in 100 years, our disposition is still the same. You can't look at it from a narrow disposition and say, well, if we're not going to run out of oil in the next 20 years, then I guess it doesn't matter to me. If you care at all about your family or grandkids, you're going to be focusing on this issue right now, because we will run out. There's no question about that. These are finite resources. We have to move into something that's of an oscillatory nature. The sun is, of course, finite too, but there's a different angle there because we do have billions of years before the sun burns out, so I think we're okay on that front. And even if the sun burnt out, well, the Earth's over if the sun burnt out, so it wouldn't matter, would it? So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Let me look one more time and make sure there's nothing I missed. I mean, we can implement maglev right now. We can implement radiation. We can implement radiant energy encapsulators. Now, you don't have to have just solar. You can have radiant energy encapsulators that take in radiant energy during the nighttime. In the future, homes will be self-contained in the sense that there'll be a photovoltaic paint. There will be radiant energy capture, solar. You'll have, and it's all built into the home. You don't even need a grid. The only thing that will require massive energy are industrial production stuff, which you can use geothermal for. Transportation can be entirely oriented through maglev. We will reduce almost 60% of the number of automobiles on the planet once we get into a sharing system. I can't reiterate this enough. We live in a wasteful society beyond comprehension, beyond anything that people can even fathom in regards to what could be once we move away from the blatant materialism and inefficiency that's perpetuated for the market system. Once we have a streamlined form of conservation coupled with a diligent form of automated technological production coupled with a direct focus on renewable energies, there really is no problem anymore as far as resources and energy. I really believe that, and I'm going to be making statistical models for that for the new film, and I'm not going to give that away right now. So, I hope that answers your question. Number 18, I'm running out of time. I have 7 minutes left. I noticed that when I approach people and try to give a DVD or printed pamphlet, they see me like some sect member or a street merchant even before they even listen to what I will say. Well, let me stop you there. Naturally, if you walk up to anybody on the street or someone knocks on, or you knock on someone's door, the first reaction they're going to have is you're trying to sell them something, or you're from a religious institution and you want to indoctrinate them. I am definitely an advocate of trying to engage people, but try to do so in a non-random way. Do it in more of a form of introduction. In other words, you go to an event and you meet people that are friends of friends. Try to do it in a less aggressive way. While I'm all about street activism, it's just more difficult. You have to be in the right environment for it, in other words. It's very different to, say, knock on the door of somebody in the Midwest who, would feel very foreign to what you're going to describe to them and might think you're trying to sell them something, than to, say, go into Union Square in New York City and set up a little booth about it and engage people or, interview people and ask people questions. The people will be much more open to engaging you in that regard. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that. Let me continue with your question. I have come up with one set of questions which are intended to put people in the right frame of mind. I see, he's listing these questions. I'm sorry, this is written in a very broken fashion. Let me just summarize this. Actually, he's not really asking a question. He's talking about how he's engaging people, so I'm going to have to leave it at that. I'm running out of time. To engage people in critical thought, as you did know. Ask them questions about the environment, things that are relevant to them. Ask them if they had a family member die of cancer, for example, and say, well, you know that the cancer establishment isn't interested in saving anyone. You could basically point that out. Get under people's skin a little bit to pull them in. Don't be offensive, and then you'll have a better chance of relaying this information in a more open, less challenged fashion, if you will. Number 19. Hello, Peter. How do you respond to allegations that by alienating people of the Christian faith, proposing a vast economic conspiracy theory, and suggesting that elements within the U.S. stage manage the whole war on terror, and that the Zeitgeist Movement is a stalking horse designed to discredit the concept of the resource-based economy by association? I've been waiting for questions like that. Well, first of all, my response to such allegations is that the allegations themselves are essentially baseless, because based on the language that you're using, I'm not in line with any of the aspects you denote, because the questioning and the framing is wrong. As far as alienating people of the Christian faith, you can't approach anyone that has a belief system with opposite views or challenging views and not expect alienation. we're not here to placate anyone. While there is a strategy to engage people, while I try to have balance and be strategic, I'm also trying to be honest. And when it comes to making films, and again, I made the first film before I even knew anything about a resource-based economy, the issue becomes moot. Some people don't like the strategy. I think the strategies work very well. I've gotten a combination of hate-filled emails coupled in with people that have completely renounced their faith, and they've moved into better ideas with science and technology. They see the merit of people learning to work together without isolated ideologies, or to share, quote, an ideology, if you will, that's based on something real, and that's the survival of the species. As far as proposing a vast economic conspiracy theory, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. The economic conspiracy theory, everything is a conspiracy theory in economics. The public is never informed about what's going on behind the scenes in the economic circles. Why do you think the Federal Reserve meets in private? Why do you think you find out about all these other problems later when some investigative reporter finally figures something out? The entire basis of economics is conspiratorial in the background. Not to mention the functionality of it is inherently conspiratorial. The very act of someone creating a product, hiding its value, selling it at profit is a conspiracy. It's dishonesty. The word conspiracy is such a loaded word now. I try to not even use that word. As far as suggesting that, quote, elements of the U.S. stage manage the whole war on terror, the suggestion is based on evidence, and it's not the statement that you're implying either. It's not the U.S. stage. Well, we can nitpick about your vocabulary here, your semantics. The war on terror is a political ruse. It's used in a very deliberate way, and I'm not going to sit here and go through the list on that. Your real central point here is how does it help or detract from our pursuits of a resource-based economy? These attributes come into play from multiple angles. You can't have people that value things that are against the natural unfolding of the universe in natural law. If they do, then they're going to self-destruct. It's their decision to self-destruct, but unfortunately they're going to bring down lots of other people with them. And this is what I talk about with the Judeo-Christian Islamic philosophy. These value systems, just like communism, capitalism, and socialism, and fascism, have no relationship to actual resource management on the planet. So therefore, alienating people is a natural byproduct, and I have no shame in expressing those aspects. You're going to have to challenge people if you want people to change, and those attributes are important in a resource-based economy, because until people start to share a fundamental value system of sharing resources, of a certain mutual reciprocality towards each other, of understanding that it's one planet and that we have to take care of ourselves and take care of it, you're going to have constant conflict. So it's very important that these divisions are broken down. I'm also running out of time. As far as the economic conspiracy, again, it's a total economic conspiracy. It's always been there. The public is constantly lied to 100% of the time by the establishment. So that's gone too. That's very important to understand a resource-based economy, because all that dishonesty is removed. As far as the act of terrorism and this nonsense of security, of restricting people's liberties, of false flag operations, which are provable, dozens of them in history, this is an important attribute just as a simple example of how far people are willing to go. The state wants to control people because if they create the paradigm of control, they can better silence dissent once the system fails even more, which is what they're preparing for. And I'm running out of time here. I really appreciate everybody and their questions, and I will talk to everybody next week, and I thank you. Get out there and help with Zeitgeist Day. This is very critical. Take care.